In the late 1980s, Franklin, Nebraska, seemed like the kind of town you only read about in magazines or see in movies. Its streets were lined with freshly painted houses, neatly trimmed lawns, and large oak trees that swayed gently in the breeze. People waved to their neighbors as they walked down the sidewalks, and small local businesses thrived on friendly, personal relationships. It was a town that prided itself on stability, success, and the appearance of safety. The kind of town where you could leave your doors unlocked at night and feel no fear. In the middle of this town's prosperity stood a man who many regarded as its hero, Lawrence King, the director of the Franklin Community Credit Union. King was the type of man who could charm anyone in a room. With his tailored suits, neatly combed hair, and confident smile, he gave the impression of wealth and influence without ever appearing arrogant. He was known for his generosity, sponsoring school programs, funding local charities, and offering small business loans to families who otherwise might never have had access to them. When he walked into a room, people instinctively paid attention. Politicians, business owners, and social leaders sought his advice, and many described him as a visionary who cared about the future of Franklin. On the surface, he was everything a small town could hope for in a leader: kind, trustworthy, and generous. To the public, Lawrence King had built dreams that many in Franklin believed were untouchable. But behind the smiles, the charity dinners, and the grand openings, there was a quiet unease. Few saw it at first. Those who did tended to dismiss it. The Franklin Community Credit Union seemed ordinary enough on the surface, a small, family-oriented bank with a reputation for helping struggling families. Yet there were subtle signs that not everything was as it appeared. Late nights in the office, stacks of files that never made it to the accounting system, and transactions that simply didn't add up. Small discrepancies at first, easily explained, or so everyone thought. But sometimes, the smallest anomalies are the first whispers of a much larger story. Paul Jensen had been working as an accountant at the credit union for nearly 5 years. He was a quiet, methodical man in his early 30s, known for his meticulous attention to detail. Most of his colleagues liked him, though they often described him as too careful or overly cautious. But Paul didn't mind. He found comfort in numbers and order, in the certainty of spreadsheets and balance sheets. He liked to think that in a world full of chaos, at least the numbers told the truth, and that truth had a way of revealing itself, even when powerful people tried to hide it. One evening, Paul was reviewing the day's transactions when something caught his eye. A transfer of hundreds of thousands of dollars had been made from the credit union to an offshore account under the name of a company he had never heard of. Curious, he pulled up the previous month's transactions. Another large transfer. And another. At first, he thought it might be part of a legitimate business deal, perhaps connected to some corporate loan or investment. But the more he looked, the more the numbers seemed to form a pattern that didn't make sense. Money was moving in and out of the bank in ways that defied logic, appearing in accounts that seemed almost entirely untraceable. Loans were issued to companies that didn't exist. Accounts had no owner. Large sums appeared and disappeared like smoke in the night. Paul's unease grew. He double-checked his calculations. Nothing had been misread. Something strange was happening, and it wasn't just a clerical error. He tried to bring it up with his supervisor, a man named Douglas Whitman, who had worked at the credit union for decades. Douglas looked over the numbers and shrugged. "Oh, those are probably just special accounts. The director handles them personally. Don't worry about it." Paul felt a chill. It wasn't often that someone told him to ignore irregularities, especially ones this significant. But he was a careful man, not prone to confrontation. He filed the observation away in his mind and decided to watch the accounts a little longer. As weeks passed, the pattern became clearer, and Paul could no longer ignore it. The sums involved were staggering, far beyond anything he had ever seen. Millions of dollars were moving through the bank without any legitimate explanation. And always, somewhere in the background, there was Lawrence King, overseeing everything with a calm and confident hand. It was as if the entire town believed in King's benevolence so deeply that no one dared question him. But Paul couldn't help questioning. Something about the scale and secrecy of these transactions suggested more than just financial mismanagement. It suggested intent, and the thought made his stomach twist with unease. Late one evening, Paul was alone in the office, the hum of fluorescent lights filling the silence. He had decided to conduct a more thorough review, digging deeper into files that were supposedly routine. That's when he stumbled across a folder tucked behind a row of client records. It was old, worn, and not listed in any filing system. Curious and a little nervous, Paul opened it. Inside were stacks of documents he had never seen. Flight receipts, hotel bookings, and detailed itineraries. There were names, too. Names of people who were not ordinary clients. Some were politicians, others were businessmen. A few were social leaders who had long been respected in the town. At the top of one page, in bold, black ink, was a single word: guests. Paul stared at the word for a long time. It seemed innocent at first, but then the meaning began to dawn on him. These weren't just clients, they were attendees at private events, events that were paid for with untraceable money and documented in secret. Paul's pulse quickened. Who were these guests? What kind of gatherings required such secrecy? The question swirled in his mind, but the folder didn't offer answers. Instead, it seemed to hint at something larger, something carefully hidden from the public eye. And it was connected directly to the man everyone trusted most in Franklin. That night, Paul couldn't sleep. The folder had opened a door he didn't know existed. He replayed every interaction he had with Lawrence King, every party, every conversation. Something didn't add up. How could one man be so generous and yet handle such enormous sums of money without raising suspicion? Why were these transactions hidden? And most importantly, what was the purpose of these events that required secrecy to this extent? Paul knew he had a decision to make. He could ignore what he had found and continue his life, pretending nothing was wrong. After all, challenging someone like Lawrence King could ruin him. It could destroy his career, make him a pariah in a town where everyone respected the director. But Paul also knew that turning away from the truth felt impossible. Something dark was hiding behind the gleaming facade of Franklin's prosperity, and he had just uncovered the first clues. The next day, Paul attempted to gather more information. He reviewed account logs, cross-checked flight records, and examined the travel documents in painstaking detail. He noticed that certain accounts were always involved in funding these trips, and that the same names kept appearing in connection with multiple flights and events. There were hotel bookings in cities far from Franklin, often for large groups of people. Some bookings were for entire floors of luxury hotels, yet no public record of these events existed. The money used to pay for these trips could not be traced through normal banking channels, suggesting a level of planning and concealment that went far beyond ordinary financial fraud. As he delved deeper, Paul's unease grew into fear. It was one thing to discover financial misconduct. It was another to realize that these transactions might be linked to something far more sinister. The word guests now seemed to take on a darker meaning, implying that these were people who attended secret gatherings not meant for public knowledge. Paul began to consider the implications. If anyone found out he was investigating, he could become a target. The stakes were suddenly much higher than he had ever imagined. Yet the curiosity, the need to understand, burned inside him. He couldn't stop. One afternoon, as Paul reviewed a series of receipts from private flight companies, he noticed a pattern. The flights always coincided with the disappearance of certain foster children in nearby towns. At first, he thought it was a coincidence. But the more he looked, the more the timing seemed deliberate. Children vanished, flights were booked, and groups of wealthy individuals traveled under secrecy. Paul felt a cold realization settle over him. This could not be a simple coincidence. There was a connection, and it was likely intentional. By the end of the week, Paul had compiled a comprehensive record of everything he had discovered. Flight receipts, hotel bookings, financial transactions, and the names of influential individuals who were all connected in ways that suggested a hidden network. He knew that if he reported this to the authorities, he would be stepping into dangerous territory. But the truth demanded exposure. Franklin's shining hero, Lawrence King, was not the man everyone believed him to be. Behind the generosity, the donations, and the polished smile, there was something lurking in the shadows, something that could change the lives of dozens, perhaps hundreds, of children. And so, Paul Jensen made a choice that would alter the course of his life forever. He began reaching out to people he trusted outside the credit union, quietly gathering support, documenting everything with meticulous care. He knew that uncovering the full truth would not be easy. Powerful people would try to stop him. Some would threaten him. Some might even attempt to silence him permanently. But Paul had seen enough to know that the world needed to know. The veil of prosperity that covered Franklin was not impenetrable. Secrets could be revealed. Lies could be exposed. And the first cracks were already appearing. For now, there. Paul worked quietly, carefully, his mind constantly returning to that single word written in black ink on the folder. Guests. It was a word that would haunt him for months to come. A word that hinted at a truth far darker than anyone in Franklin could imagine. Behind the glittering parties, the lavish donations, and the charming smile of Lawrence King, there was a shadow network, a hidden world where money, power, and secrecy intersected. And Paul Jensen had just stepped into it, unaware of how deep the rabbit hole would go, and how dangerous the truth would become. As Franklin's sun rose over neatly lined streets, most people went about their days without a second thought. Children walked to school carrying backpacks full of homework, parents waved to neighbors from driveways, and shopkeepers greeted each passerby with smiles. The town seemed ordinary, the kind of place where nothing terrible could happen. But beneath this calm, a storm was brewing, a storm that no one in Franklin could have anticipated. While Paul Jensen was quietly uncovering the financial anomalies at the credit union, another person was noticing a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Karen Miles had worked as a social worker in Franklin for over a decade, dedicating her life to protecting the town's most vulnerable children. She knew the names, faces, and stories of dozens of kids who had come through the foster system. She celebrated their successes and mourned their struggles. Her job often felt like a thankless task, but she loved it. Until recently, Franklin had seemed like a safe place for children, a town where social workers could actually make a difference. Then the disappearances started. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A 12-year-old boy vanished from his foster home one evening. He had no history of running away, no friends in trouble, and no reason to leave. Karen filed a missing persons report, thinking perhaps he had slipped away for a night, scared or confused. But then another child disappeared, a 13-year-old girl, then a 14-year-old boy, and within months, the pattern became undeniable. What made these disappearances so alarming was not just the number, it was the nature of the cases. Unlike typical runaways, these children didn't leave notes, take belongings, or contact friends. They seemed to vanish into thin air, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. The police initially treated the cases as isolated incidents. Franklin had always been safe, and officers assumed the children might eventually return. But Karen knew better. Something was terribly wrong. One day, a faint, trembling rumor reached her from a small group of teens at a community center. A girl whispered about secret parties held in houses on the outskirts of the city. The kids didn't speak openly, afraid of being overheard. Karen's heart pounded as she pressed them for details, careful not to scare them. The information was vague, fragmented, and almost unbelievable. They spoke of strange adults, of private flights, and of houses where children were told to obey rules they didn't understand. At first, Karen thought it must be exaggeration or fear-fueled imagination. But then, the pieces began to fit. One afternoon, Karen received a call from a local police officer. A young girl had been found wandering near a highway several miles outside Franklin. She was dainty, exhausted, and terrified, speaking only enough English to convey her fear. Her name was Amy, and she was 15. She had been missing for nearly a month. Karen rushed to meet her, not knowing what she would find. When Karen first saw Amy, the girl was curled on the floor of a small, sterile room in the local police station. Her eyes darted around constantly, avoiding anyone's gaze. She clutched a thin blanket around herself as if it were a shield. Karen approached slowly, kneeling to meet her at eye level. "It's okay," she whispered. "You're safe now." Amy flinched but didn't run. She seemed frozen in a mixture of fear and disbelief, as though she still couldn't process that anyone meant her no harm. It took hours for Amy to feel safe enough to speak. At first, she only answered in short, hesitant sentences. But as Karen gained her trust, the story emerged, one that would chill the hearts of anyone who heard it. Amy spoke of large, imposing houses, hidden from view, where she and other teenagers were taken against their will. They were told to follow strict rules, to obey every instruction without question, and to never speak of what happened to anyone outside. They were always closely monitored, and adults arrived in black cars, often late at night, to collect and return the children. Amy's account was fragmented but terrifyingly consistent. She described private planes landing in remote areas, children being taken aboard without explanation, and the presence of people she recognized from photographs of politicians and wealthy local figures. There were gifts, luxuries, and treats offered as a form of reward, but they came with strict conditions. If a child disobeyed, they were threatened with punishment that was never described in detail, yet the fear in Amy's eyes conveyed its severity. Karen knew she was holding evidence of something unprecedented. The patterns she had noticed in the missing children cases were now taking on horrifying meaning. These were not ordinary runaways. These were children being taken intentionally, transported, and hidden in a network that was carefully orchestrated and protected. She reported Amy's testimony to her supervisors, expecting swift action from the authorities. The response, however, was far from what she hoped. Instead of mobilizing resources to find the network responsible, officials began questioning Amy's credibility. Her story was called impossible, far-fetched, and unreliable. Some suggested that she had fabricated the tale out of fear or confusion. Karen could feel her frustration building. She had seen enough to know that fear and secrecy often accompany real danger, and Amy's terror was genuine. But the skepticism of the authorities was demoralizing. The system designed to protect children was failing them at every turn. Undeterred, Karen began her own investigation. She started by mapping the disappearances, looking for any patterns in time, location, and circumstance. Slowly, an unsettling picture emerged. The missing children were mostly from vulnerable backgrounds, foster homes, single-parent families, or economically struggling households. Their disappearances coincided with the arrival of luxury cars in their neighborhoods, often late at night, and sometimes aligned with private flights from local airports. The pattern suggested a level of organization and planning that went far beyond anything Karen had encountered in her career. As she dug deeper, she realized the network responsible was not only sophisticated but also highly secretive. The adults involved seemed to understand the vulnerabilities of their victims, using fear, promises, and control to manipulate the children. Karen began reaching out to trusted colleagues in social services and law enforcement, quietly sharing her findings and urging action. Some believed her, others hesitated, wary of confronting powerful figures whose influence extended into the highest levels of the community. Meanwhile, Amy's account began to provide small but crucial leads. She remembered the shape of certain houses, the routes taken to reach them, and even fragments of conversations overheard in whispers. She described the presence of other teenagers, some younger, some older, and how they were treated differently depending on compliance or disobedience. Her recollection of names, gestures, and locations was surprisingly detailed, given the trauma she had experienced. Karen meticulously documented every word, understanding that the smallest detail could be the key to unraveling the entire network. As the investigation continued, strange occurrences began to unsettle Karen and her team. Files on missing children vanished from offices. Witnesses who had initially agreed to speak suddenly recanted, claiming they had misremembered events or that their previous statements had been exaggerated. Some families of the missing children were contacted by strangers warning them not to cooperate with authorities. Karen began to sense that there were forces at work deliberately obstructing the investigation. Despite the obstacles, Karen pressed on. She connected with Paul Jensen, the accountant who had been quietly following the financial anomalies at Franklin Community Credit Union. Their collaboration revealed an even more disturbing layer of the network. The money flowing through the credit union appeared to fund private flights, luxury accommodations, and events that matched Amy's descriptions. The same names appeared on both flight manifests and financial records, indicating a direct connection between the children's disappearances and the lavish gatherings attended by influential figures. With every new piece of evidence, the scope of the operation became clearer. Yet the danger grew as well. Karen began receiving anonymous phone calls warning her to stop investigating. Strange cars were seen parked near her office, and she noticed she was being followed on occasion. Fear was a constant companion, But she refused to yield. The children had no one else to fight for them, and she could not abandon them. One night, after reviewing flight logs and cross-referencing them with the dates of disappearances, Karen made a discovery that sent chills down her spine. Many of the flights coincided not only with the missing children but also with high-profile events in the city. There was a deliberate pattern. While the town celebrated festivals, ribbon cuttings, and political gatherings, children were quietly being taken, moved from one location to another, and kept hidden from the public eye. The network operated under the guise of ordinary life, using the town's own celebrations as a cover for its sinister activities. Amy, though traumatized, became a crucial source of intelligence. She recalled the faces of some of the adults, the vehicles they drove, and even the subtle signals used to control and intimidate the children. Her courage inspired others to come forward, though many did so anonymously, fearful of retaliation. Karen realized that uncovering the truth would not only require persistence but also ingenuity. The adults behind these disappearances were careful, methodical, and extremely well-connected. Confronting them directly could have disastrous consequences for anyone attempting to expose them. As weeks turned into months, the investigation expanded beyond Franklin. Patterns in the disappearances suggested a broader network operating across multiple towns and states. Social workers and investigators began to coordinate, sharing information in secret meetings and encrypted communications. Slowly, a map began to emerge, a web of connections linking missing children, financial transactions, and elite individuals whose public personas masked darker activities. Karen's determination never wavered. Each new detail reinforced the reality she had come to accept. Franklin's pristine image was a facade. Beneath the surface, a network existed that preyed on the town's most vulnerable children, manipulating them with fear and secrecy. The combination of wealth, influence, and careful planning made it nearly impossible to trace. Yet Karen refused to let the truth remain hidden. By the end of the year, the missing children's cases had gained national attention. Investigators from outside the state began to take interest, prompted by Amy's testimony and the evidence uncovered by Karen and Paul. The initial skepticism of local authorities began to give way to cautious cooperation. But the deeper the investigation went, the more apparent it became that they were confronting not only a criminal network but also a powerful system determined to protect itself. Witnesses continued to recant or disappear. Documents were misplaced or mysteriously removed, and anyone who came too close to the truth faced threats and intimidation. Even so, Karen never wavered. She had seen the faces of the children, felt their fear, and heard their stories. She knew that exposing the network would be dangerous, complicated, and possibly dangerous to herself, but the cost of silence was far greater. These children deserved justice. They deserved to be seen, to be heard, and to be protected. Amy's courage, combined with the tireless work of Karen, Paul, and a growing network of allies, began to chip away at the illusion of safety in Franklin. Each clue, each flight record, and each witness testimony revealed that the disappearances were not random but part of a calculated, well-funded operation. As the investigation gained momentum, it became clear that what they were uncovering was far larger than anyone had imagined, a hidden world of power, secrecy, and unimaginable danger. And though the full scale of the network was still hidden, one fact had become undeniable. The children were not lost by accident. They had been taken deliberately, moved through a carefully constructed system, and silenced by fear. The question that haunted Karen day and night was no longer whether the network existed. It was whether anyone would be brave enough to stop it before more children disappeared into the shadows. The quiet of the Franklin Community Credit Union offices belied the storm that was building inside. Paul Jensen had spent weeks compiling his evidence, documenting financial anomalies, tracing the flow of millions of dollars through accounts that seemed to exist only on paper. Each discovery made the picture more alarming. Each connection pointed to something larger and darker than he had ever imagined. At first, he had thought it was just financial fraud, embezzlement hidden behind the facade of a respected bank. But as he compared records to flight logs and hotel bookings, he realized that the anomalies were far more sinister. They weren't just numbers, they were a map to secret events involving powerful people and missing children. Paul worked late into the night, often alone in the office, going over every spreadsheet and every receipt with painstaking care. He cross-referenced hotel bookings with the names of the guests from the mysterious folder he had discovered. Time and again, the same names appeared: politicians, business owners, and community leaders whom everyone in Franklin admired. Their public personas were polished and respectable, but the financial records suggested they were attending events funded through secret accounts. Paul's stomach turned as he considered the implications. These were not ordinary social gatherings. They were organized, meticulously funded, and shrouded in secrecy. The first breakthrough came when Paul noticed that some of the private flights matched the dates of several recent missing children cases. It wasn't just a coincidence. The timing was too precise, too deliberate. Children disappeared in small towns across the state, and on those same days, flights were booked through shell companies using money traced back to the credit union. The connection was invisible to anyone who wasn't looking for it, but Paul could see the pattern clearly. The question that haunted him now was simple and terrifying. What happened to these children once they were taken? By now, Paul realized he could not investigate alone. He needed support from someone with authority and experience, someone outside the credit union who could take the evidence seriously. After careful thought, he contacted a federal investigator based in a nearby city. The man, Agent Harold Simmons, was known for handling complex financial crimes, and Paul hoped he would recognize the gravity of what he had uncovered. He arranged a secret meeting, carrying his meticulously organized files in a briefcase, aware that being discovered at this point could put him in serious danger. The meeting took place in a quiet diner on the edge of town, far from the credit union and prying eyes. Paul laid out everything: the financial anomalies, the secret accounts, the flight records, and the connection to missing children. Agent Simmons listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When Paul finished, the agent remained silent for several long moments, then leaned back in his chair. "If what you're saying is true," Simmons said, "this goes far beyond financial fraud. We could be looking at a coordinated network operating across state lines. We need to move carefully." With federal attention now involved, Paul felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief because the evidence he had uncovered would finally be taken seriously. Dread because he understood the dangers. Powerful people had much to lose if the truth came out, and he was now in a position where exposing it could make him a target. His life, his reputation, and even his safety were at risk. But he also knew that turning back was not an option. These were children, vulnerable and alone, and someone had to speak for them. The investigation began in earnest. Federal agents descended on Franklin quietly, reviewing Paul's files, tracing transactions, and interviewing bank employees. At first, there was a sense of disbelief among some locals. How could such a respected institution be involved in something so sinister? How could Lawrence King, the man who had built dreams for so many families, be connected to financial wrongdoing and the disappearance of children? Public trust in the credit union and its director began to wobble, though few understood the full scale of what was happening. Paul found himself drawn into the investigation in ways he had never anticipated. Agents asked him to testify, to provide detailed explanations of the transactions, the flight records, and the mysterious folder labeled guests. Each day, he relived the discovery that had shaken him so deeply, recounting evidence that suggested a network operating in plain sight, yet entirely hidden from public scrutiny. He began to notice subtle changes in his own environment: cars parked outside his home at unusual hours, unfamiliar faces lingering near the credit union, and whispered warnings from colleagues who seemed suddenly nervous. He realized that his actions had drawn attention, and not all of it friendly. Meanwhile, other pieces of the puzzle began to emerge. Agents interviewed families of the missing children, and spoke with social workers like Karen Miles. Slowly, a pattern began to take shape. The children were being taken from foster homes, schools, and neighborhoods where supervision was minimal. They were moved quickly, often through private transportation that left no official records, and were hidden in locations that appeared ordinary to anyone who wasn't paying attention. Each detail added urgency to the investigation. Every day that passed was another day children could be at risk. The first real break came when one of the teenagers, Amy, agreed to speak in detail under federal protection. Her testimony was chilling. She described private houses where children were kept temporarily, strict rules enforced by adults who instilled fear through threats, and gatherings attended by influential figures. She spoke of secrecy, manipulation, and the constant tension of being watched. Though she could not name everyone, her recollections confirmed the connection between the financial records, the flight logs, and the mysterious events Paul had discovered. For the first time, investigators had more than numbers. They had a voice, a witness who could guide them to the hidden network. Yet the investigation was not straightforward. Almost immediately, efforts to obstruct the case appeared. Some witnesses who had initially cooperated suddenly refused to testify, citing fear for their safety. Others recanted statements under mysterious circumstances. There were reports of missing documents, misfiled evidence, and delayed court proceedings. Even Paul, despite his careful precautions, began receiving anonymous warnings, subtle messages indicating that powerful people were aware of his involvement and did not want the truth to emerge. Each day, the risks grew, and the investigation became a delicate balance between uncovering the truth and protecting those involved. Despite these obstacles, federal agents pressed forward. They executed controlled surveillance, tracked transactions, and identified key properties linked to the financial accounts. These included rental homes, private event venues, and small aviation facilities where chartered flights took off without attracting attention. Agents discovered that some of the properties were registered under shell companies, further obscuring the true ownership. The sophistication of the operation suggested careful planning and an awareness of legal loopholes designed to evade scrutiny. Paul continued to play a crucial role. His knowledge of the credit union's inner workings allowed investigators to trace the flow of funds with a precision that would have been impossible otherwise. He identified patterns in transactions, connected payments to specific flights, and helped uncover hidden links to certain events. Each new discovery deepened the mystery while also increasing the danger. Paul had become more than an accountant. He was a key figure in exposing a network that stretched far beyond the town of Franklin. Tension mounted as agents moved to secure evidence. They raided properties discreetly, taking care not to alert those under investigation. In some cases, they found traces of children, items left behind, personal belongings, and signs of occupancy. These discoveries confirmed suspicions and added credibility to witness accounts, but they also highlighted the calculated nature of the operation. Whoever was behind it had covered their tracks carefully, leaving just enough to manipulate appearances and avoid legal scrutiny. Public awareness began to grow. While local media reported on the financial crimes at Franklin Community Credit Union, the connection to missing children remained largely under wraps. Officials were cautious, fearing backlash or accusations of overreach. But within law enforcement circles, the investigation gained momentum. More children came forward, recounting similar experiences of fear, coercion, and secrecy. Each testimony added urgency, emphasizing that the network was active, ongoing, and targeting the most vulnerable. As the investigation continued, Paul reflected on the path that had brought him here. He had started as a quiet accountant, concerned only with numbers, ledgers, and the integrity of the credit union. But his curiosity and courage had uncovered a pattern far more disturbing than anyone could have imagined. He realized that ordinary people, even in a small town, could confront extraordinary corruption. But he also understood the personal cost. Fear, isolation, and constant vigilance became part of his life. There was no turning back. In the months that followed, the federal investigation continued to expand, tracing connections beyond Franklin to other towns and states. Agents discovered that the network had operated with precision, exploiting vulnerabilities in the foster system, legal loopholes, and the influence of powerful individuals. The investigation was painstaking, often slow, and fraught with setbacks. Witnesses vanished, documents went missing, and threats persisted. Yet the team persevered, driven by the knowledge that children's lives were at stake. By the end of the year, the first arrests were made, signaling a turning point in the case. Individuals connected to the financial irregularities and the transportation of children were taken into custody. The credit union itself became the focus of intense scrutiny, with every transaction analyzed and every employee interviewed. Paul Jensen, though still cautious, had begun to feel the weight of his role. He had become the whistleblower, the one who had dared to speak out when no one else would. His evidence had set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone. Even with arrests, the investigation remained far from complete. The network's full scope was still unclear. Many questions remained unanswered: the extent of involvement by influential figures, the fate of children who had disappeared without a trace, and the methods used to cover up activities that had gone unnoticed for so long. Every new discovery brought both answers and deeper mysteries, revealing a world of secrecy that few could have imagined. Through it all, one fact became undeniable: Paul Jensen had exposed the first thread in a tangled web of crime. The children's safety, the truth behind the disappearances, and the accountability of those involved now rested on the painstaking work of investigators willing to follow the evidence wherever it led. And though the road ahead would be long and dangerous, the whistleblower's courage had set in motion a fight for justice that would shake Franklin to its core. The courthouse in Franklin was unusually quiet that morning, though the tension in the air was palpable. Reporters lined the steps, cameras poised to capture every moment, while spectators filled the benches inside, whispering in anticipation. The trial of Lawrence King had become the story of the decade, not just in Franklin but across the nation. People wanted answers, and they wanted justice. The streets outside were crowded with protesters demanding accountability and journalists reporting on every rumor, every whisper, every supposed clue. For the first time, Franklin's shining image was cracked, and the cracks were wide enough for the truth to slip through. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was equally tense. Lawrence King sat at the defendant's table, calm, composed, almost serene, with the faintest smile playing across his lips. It was a smile that unsettled anyone who looked at him for too long, the kind of smile that suggested confidence that he was untouchable. Around him, his legal team worked quietly, reviewing documents, consulting with one another, and occasionally casting a glance at the growing pile of evidence against their client. Across the room, prosecutors sat ready to present a case they believed would not only prove financial wrongdoing but also expose the sinister network that had targeted the town's most vulnerable children. The trial opened with a dramatic statement from the lead prosecutor. He laid out the financial crimes, the misappropriation of funds, and the suspicious transactions that Paul Jensen had uncovered. The numbers were staggering, and the evidence seemed airtight. Charts were displayed on monitors, spreadsheets filled with figures, transfers traced from Franklin Community Credit Union to private companies, then to flights, hotels, and event venues. Every piece of evidence pointed to deliberate and systematic wrongdoing. For the first week, it seemed the case was strong, that the prosecution would not only secure convictions for financial fraud but perhaps also unravel the full scope of the criminal network. Then came the testimony of the children, the witnesses who had survived and escaped the hidden network. Amy was first. Her voice was steady but quiet, her hands trembling slightly as she recounted the events she had endured. She described the large houses, the private planes, the rooms where children were told to obey or face consequences. The courtroom was silent, hanging on her every word. Prosecutors had spent months preparing her, ensuring she was supported, protected, and ready to testify. Her courage was remarkable. For a moment, it seemed as if the truth could finally come to light, that justice might actually be served. But then, cracks began to appear. The defense team attacked her credibility relentlessly. They questioned her memory, her perception, her motives. They suggested that she had been influenced by media reports, that fear had caused her to exaggerate, that she might be confusing dreams with reality. Each question seemed to shake Amy's confidence, and although she held her ground, the seed of doubt was planted in the minds of jurors and spectators alike. The defense then presented their own experts, psychologists and social workers, who argued that the human mind is susceptible to suggestion, that trauma can distort memory, and that stories of abuse can be fabricated without malicious intent. The courtroom was filled with tension as the seemingly credible experts questioned the very foundation of Amy's testimony. Other witnesses were called, each with similar experiences to recount, each prepared to testify to the horrifying events they had endured. But as the trial progressed, the unthinkable began to happen. Key witnesses began recanting their statements. Some claimed that they had been mistaken, that their previous testimonies were exaggerated or false. Others refused to testify altogether, citing fear for their safety. The sudden reversal of so many witnesses shocked everyone in the courtroom. Prosecutors were blindsided, struggling to adjust as the very foundation of their case began to crumble before their eyes. The defense capitalized immediately, painting the investigation as flawed, the witnesses as unreliable, and the entire narrative as a fabrication fueled by rumor and fear. The courtroom drama was further intensified by the sudden disappearance of crucial evidence. Sight and documents, once thought secure, were declared lost or unavailable. Flight logs, financial records, and property leases, the very evidence connecting the financial crimes to the alleged abuse, was suddenly missing, misfiled, or mysteriously inaccessible. Prosecutors scrambled to locate backup copies, while defense attorneys questioned the integrity of the entire investigation. The tension in the courtroom was suffocating. What had begun as a straightforward trial for financial mismanagement had transformed into a battle over credibility, memory, and the reliability of evidence. Public reaction to the trial was explosive. Outside the courthouse, people argued passionately, some demanding that the network be exposed, others claiming that the allegations were sensationalized and unproven. The media, sensing the drama, covered every development, often speculating wildly about the missing files, the recanted testimonies, and the possible influence of powerful figures behind the scenes. Franklin was gripped by fear, fascination, and confusion. The line between truth and rumor blurred, leaving the public to question what was real and what was constructed for headlines. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere remained tense. Prosecutors struggled to maintain momentum as the defense systematically dismantled the allegations beyond financial misconduct. Every attempt to tie the network to the missing children and secret events was met with skepticism, often successfully undermined by the recanting witnesses and the defense's aggressive questioning. The legal strategy of the defense became increasingly clear. If the jury could doubt the credibility of the testimony, they could ignore the financial links to the alleged network. Slowly, the trial began to tilt in favor of the defense, despite the overwhelming evidence of embezzlement and fraud. By the fourth week, the courtroom had become a theater of contradictions. Witnesses who had once been confident and detailed in their accounts now appeared hesitant and unsure. Lawyers argued over procedural details, evidence disputes, and interpretations of testimony. Judges admonished attorneys for interruptions, but even their interventions could not hide the fact that the case was unraveling. The very complexity of the allegations, the intertwining of finance, travel records, and witness testimony, made it difficult to present a clear narrative. The story that had captivated the nation was now on the verge of collapse, not because the events didn't happen, but because proving them in a court of law had become almost impossible. Then came the final blow. During a crucial session, one of the most compelling witnesses, a teenager who had provided detailed testimony about private events, announced that they were recanting everything. The defense attorney smiled faintly, sensing victory, while prosecutors sank into their seats, stunned. The witness claimed that fear, stress, and influence from adults around them had caused them to misremember events. The courtroom was stunned into silence. A narrative that had seemed airtight just weeks before was now vulnerable to collapse. The defense seized the opportunity, arguing that the entire investigation was flawed, that the prosecutors had relied too heavily on inconsistent testimonies, and that the allegations could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. By the time closing arguments were presented, the atmosphere was tense but subdued. The prosecution, desperate to salvage the case, emphasized the financial crimes, presenting mountains of evidence detailing embezzlement, secret transfers, and the misuse of funds. But when it came to the allegations of abuse and trafficking, their case had been severely weakened. The defense highlighted every recanted statement, every missing file, every procedural misstep, weaving a narrative of doubt that resonated with the jury. The judge instructed the jurors to consider only what could be proven, not what could be speculated. Yet in the minds of everyone present, the question lingered. How could so many threads of evidence vanish or contradict each other in such a way? When the verdict was finally delivered, the courtroom was tense with anticipation. Lawrence King was found guilty of financial fraud and embezzlement. The room seemed to exhale in relief. But as for the allegations of trafficking and abuse, the jury declared them unproven. In legal terms, the political sex ring had never existed. For the prosecutors, the collapse was devastating. For the survivors and the children's advocates, It was a bitter and painful disappointment. The evidence, witness testimony, and investigative work seemed to vanish in the eyes of the law, leaving the public with more questions than answers. Outside the courthouse, reactions were mixed. Some celebrated the financial convictions as justice served. Others protested, claiming that the system had failed the children, that the truth had been buried by fear, power, and influence. The press reported extensively on the missing files, the recanted witnesses, and the sudden collapse of the trafficking allegations. Public outrage simmered, but without new evidence, the case remained closed. Franklin's reputation was tarnished, its innocence questioned, and its people left to wonder what had truly happened behind the closed doors of power. For Paul Jensen, the trial was a turning point. His courage in uncovering the financial irregularities had helped bring King to justice for embezzlement, but the larger truth of the network and the missing children remained elusive. He realized that exposing corruption, especially when it involved the powerful and influential, was a battle fraught with obstacles, delays, and compromises. Yet he also understood that without his whistleblowing, the entire operation might have remained invisible. The truth, though obscured in court, had at least begun to see the light. The trial that collapsed became a cautionary tale in Franklin and beyond. It illustrated the limits of the legal system when faced with secrecy, power, and manipulation. It demonstrated how easily fear and influence could unravel justice, and how complex it could be to hold the influential accountable. And most of all, it left an enduring question in the minds of everyone who followed the case. How could such a vast and sinister operation collapse in the courtroom, leaving so many victims without a voice, while the perpetrators walked away from the allegations unscathed? Despite the collapse, some investigators refused to let the case fade into obscurity. They continued to pursue leads, to document patterns, and to protect the children who had survived. They knew the network was still active, still hiding behind wealth and status, still preying on those who were vulnerable. The trial had failed to expose the full extent of the crimes, but the work of uncovering the truth was far from over. For those involved, the fight for justice continued, fueled by the courage of a few determined individuals who refused to be silenced, even when the courtroom itself seemed to betray them. And so, the Franklin scandal remained suspended in a state of haunting ambiguity. Officially, the political sex ring had never existed. Legally, only financial crimes had been proven. Yet for those who had seen the evidence, heard the stories, and lived through the investigation, the truth was undeniable. Something dark, organized, and deliberate had thrived in the shadows of Franklin, hidden from public scrutiny, protected by fear, and preserved by the power of those who refused to be exposed. The trial had collapsed, but the shadow of the scandal continued to loom over the town, leaving the world to wonder what had truly been lost to secrecy, influence, and silence. The courtroom doors had closed, the gavel had fallen, and Lawrence King's convictions for financial crimes had been recorded in legal history. To the public, the Franklin scandal was solved. The official story was simple. A few bad actors had mismanaged funds, some children had been imagined as victims, and the town could move on. But beneath this veneer of closure, a storm of questions, doubts, and unanswered mysteries continued to rage. For those who had been closest to the investigation, the whistleblowers, the social workers, the journalists, justice had never felt complete. Something crucial had been lost, and it was not just evidence. It was the truth. Daniel Reeves, a journalist with a reputation for digging into unsolved cases, had been following the Franklin story since the beginning. He had watched the trial with a mixture of fascination and frustration. On one hand, the financial crimes had been exposed, and King had been held accountable to some extent. On the other hand, the alleged political sex ring, the disappearances of children, and the evidence of a hidden network had collapsed under the weight of recanted testimonies and missing documents. For Daniel, it was a story that demanded answers. Something about the trial didn't add up. How could so many threads of evidence disappear so completely? Why had witnesses recanted? And who stood to benefit from the collapse of the case? Determined to find the answers, Daniel began filing public records requests for all investigation documents, evidence logs, and police reports related to the Franklin scandal. What he found, or rather, what he didn't find, was alarming. Entire files were missing, Audio recordings of witness interviews, previously thought to exist in secure federal archives, were gone. Evidence logs showed gaps that could not be explained, and some crucial documents were marked destroyed. The gaps were not minor. They were substantial enough to call the integrity of the entire investigation into question. It was as if someone had gone through the files with a purpose, removing, erasing, and hiding evidence that could have implicated powerful people. Daniel realized he had stumbled onto a story even more compelling than the trial itself. He reached out to former investigators, many of whom had left law enforcement after the trial. Speaking off the record, they confirmed his suspicions. "We were told to stop asking questions," one former agent admitted quietly, glancing around as if the walls themselves might be listening. Sight and names were untouchable. Sight and evidence wasn't meant to be found. If you wanted to pursue it further, you risked everything: your career, your safety, your life. Another former investigator nodded grimly. "It's not that the network didn't exist. It's that some people decided it should never be exposed. That's why files vanished. That's why witnesses were pressured or disappeared." As Daniel dug deeper, he began connecting dots that had been overlooked during the trial. The missing children, the shell companies, the private flights, and the lavish parties all pointed to an operation that was highly organized, funded with enormous sums of money, and protected by layers of influence that extended into politics, business, and law enforcement. Even after the courtroom verdicts, it was clear that someone had been managing a cover-up at the highest levels. The system designed to protect children had been systematically undermined, and the files that had vanished were at the center of that suppression. Daniel's reporting reignited public interest in the Franklin scandal. News outlets picked up his findings, social media exploded with discussions, and conspiracy theorists claimed vindication. People began asking questions they had been too afraid to ask before. How many children had truly disappeared? How many witnesses had been coerced or threatened into silence? Which powerful figures had been involved, and how had they managed to protect themselves? The public, hungry for answers, demanded investigations, press conferences, and transparency. But the official response remained frustratingly minimal. Authorities insisted that the case had been thoroughly investigated and that no further action was warranted. The files, it seemed, were gone, and the trail had gone cold. For the survivors and families of the missing children, the collapse of the trial and the disappearance of evidence was devastating. Parents of children who had vanished years earlier were left with no closure, no answers, and a gnawing sense that justice had been denied. For the teenagers who had testified, the experience had been traumatizing. They had been subjected to public scrutiny, disbelief, and intense pressure, only to see the network they described vanish from the courtroom record. Many moved away, trying to escape the attention and the memory, while others struggled with fear, knowing that the people responsible had likely walked free. Despite these challenges, some investigators and advocates refused to abandon the search for truth. They continued gathering evidence, tracking leads, and interviewing witnesses in secret. Slowly, fragments of the network were reconstructed through personal accounts, financial breadcrumbs, and hidden connections. Even if the files had vanished from official archives, the truth could not be completely erased from memory. Whistleblowers like Paul Jensen maintained detailed personal copies of documents, encrypted and hidden, as a safeguard against total suppression. Social workers like Karen Miles continued to follow up with children who had survived, documenting their stories in hopes of eventually bringing the responsible parties to justice. The more Daniel investigated, the more disturbing the picture became. The missing files were not just a bureaucratic oversight. They were a deliberate act of erasure. Certain names appeared repeatedly in connections to the network: influential politicians, wealthy business people, and public figures whose reputations would have been destroyed if implicated. The evidence suggested that a powerful coalition had intervened to protect itself, ensuring that the most damning documents, testimonies, and financial records would never see the light of day. In effect, the trial's collapse was not a failure of justice but a victory for those who wielded influence and could manipulate the system. Daniel also discovered evidence of ongoing threats and intimidation aimed at anyone who attempted to pursue the story after the trial. Witnesses had been approached, offered bribes, or threatened with legal and personal consequences if they spoke publicly. Investigators had been warned to stand down, or face career-ending repercussions. The system of suppression was sophisticated and subtle, designed to prevent the public from understanding the scale of the operation or identifying the people responsible. It became clear that the Franklin scandal had never truly ended. It had simply been buried under layers of secrecy, manipulation, and fear. One particularly chilling discovery involved a set of flight records that had been partially erased from federal databases. These flights corresponded to the dates when several children had vanished from foster homes, schools, and neighborhoods. By reconstructing the data from secondary sources, airline receipts, hotel logs, and witness accounts, Daniel was able to show a clear connection between the financial transfers, the flights, and the disappearance of children. Though this evidence could not be used in court, it provided a glimpse of the network's operational sophistication. The flights were coordinated with precision, designed to transport children without attracting attention, and the entire operation had been funded through seemingly legitimate financial channels. As Daniel pieced together these fragments, he realized that the story of Franklin was not just about one man or one bank. It was about a system of power, secrecy, and manipulation that allowed a network of wealthy and influential individuals to operate above the law. It was about the way institutions, from law enforcement to the courts, could be influenced, coerced, or corrupted to protect those at the top. And most importantly, it was about the children, innocent victims whose lives had been altered forever, and whose stories had been suppressed in the pursuit of appearances and influence. Daniel's work culminated in a series of articles and investigative reports that reignited public scrutiny of Franklin. His findings were detailed, backed by documents he had recovered independently, and corroborated by whistleblowers and surviving witnesses. The reports painted a picture that was both horrifying and compelling. A network of crime, protected by wealth and power, had existed in plain sight, and its most damning evidence had been erased from the public record. The narrative that had collapsed in the courtroom was now being reconstructed in the court of public opinion. For some, Daniel's reporting brought a sense of vindication. Survivors of the network, families of missing children, and advocates for justice finally saw their experiences acknowledged, if only in part. For others, it was a chilling reminder of the fragility of truth when it conflicts with power. The vanished files were a symbol of what could be hidden when influence and intimidation were applied systematically, and the Franklin scandal became a cautionary tale about the limits of accountability in the face of wealth and authority. Even today, the mystery of the vanished files continues to haunt Franklin and the broader public. Scholars, journalists, and truth-seekers debate what really happened, who was involved, and why certain evidence was destroyed. The answers may never be fully known, but the legacy of the files, and the network they concealed, remains a powerful reminder that appearances can be deceiving. The town that once seemed perfect, the community that trusted its leaders, and the system that promised protection had all been vulnerable to corruption, secrecy, and manipulation. And so, the Franklin scandal ended not with closure, but with questions. Officially, the political sex ring had never existed. Officially, the case had been resolved with financial convictions. But for those who had seen the evidence, followed the money, and listened to the stories of the children, the truth was undeniable. Files may vanish, witnesses may disappear, and courts may collapse under pressure, but the shadows of Franklin's hidden world continued to linger. The network had not been destroyed, it had simply been concealed, leaving the town, the nation, and the world to wonder what truly occurred behind the polished facades of wealth, power, and influence. For Daniel Reeves, the journey had changed him. He understood that uncovering the truth in a world of power and secrecy required courage, persistence, and a willingness to confront forces far larger than oneself. The vanished files, though frustrating and infuriating, were a testament to the magnitude of the operation and the lengths to which some would go to protect it. And though the full story might never be told in a courtroom, it lived on in the documents, the testimonies, and the investigative work of those unwilling to let the truth be buried. In the end, the Franklin scandal became more than a story of financial crimes, vanished files, and collapsed trials. It became a symbol of the enduring struggle between truth and power, between innocence and corruption, and between those who are willing to speak and those who seek to silence them. The files that vanished may never be recovered, but their absence serves as a permanent reminder of the shadows that can exist behind even the most respectable facades. And for Franklin, for the children who disappeared, and for the world watching, the story remains a haunting question. How much of the truth will ever be known, and how many secrets will remain forever hidden?